Hello and welcome to another episode of Mike and Dave's Hi-Fi Riff. I'm Mike Evans.
And I'm David Price.
And David, today, what are we going to be reviewing?
It's the Mission 770 loudspeaker. The old one and the new one.
The old one and the new one. We're going to do two in one.
We are, yes.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the new one is pretty much brand new as we speak.
Yeah.
We've got a pair here. They look great. They're incredibly similar in style to the old ones. They've done a bit of a sort of a retro refit almost, haven't they?
Yes, I think in terms of the actual size, it's pretty much identical, but the new ones are slightly deeper. But I think they weigh a few kilos more as well. But they're strangely, spookily similar. If you can, anyone who's old enough to remember the originals, just like us, just about. So it's as George Bush would say, it's deja vu all over again.
It really is, so it's interesting because full disclosure time. I remember listening to the original ones back in the day, as you say, when we were just about old enough to, and they didn't quite do it for me. Now I'm probably going to upset an awful lot of people who bought them and loved them, and there are lots of people who did, and I understand why people bought them and loved them. But for me, I don't know, they just didn't quite hit the spot.
Yeah, but you don't like anything except Lynn speakers.
Well, now you say that, but now I do, because I think the new ones are great.
Yes.
And I really like them, and I've had the pleasure of listening to them for the last few days.
That's right. Well, those and the ATC SCM40s, you've now got two non-Lin loudspeakers that you like.
I know. I'm getting a bit worried here. I have to buy a pair of non-Lins.
I know. Yeah.
And I would happily do that because I'm really impressed with both ATCs and the Missions. In fact, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about this, but the big decision would be which ones would you buy?
Yeah.
Because they're both great. But I'm very taken by the new Missions.
Yeah.
And we've just had a chance to have a blast as well. And they do an awful lot of things very, very well.
Yeah.
And they have a characteristic sound.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't say they were necessarily neutral.
No.
But I like the characteristic.
Yes, and I think I think you could say the same with the originals. Actually, I mean the special thing I think about the original Mission 770s were that they kind of delivered us or saved us from a world of BBC loudspeakers in the 70s, So I'm not talking about the US or Japan here, but in the UK, then we had sort of BBC designed speakers up to our, sort of ears, didn't we?
We did, And Rogers and Spenders and all that sort of stuff.
Chartwells and all that,
Yes.
And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but they had a certain flavour.
Yes.
And people who spent reasonably large amounts of money on hi-fi in the mid 1970s tended to be older men, with certain types of tastes, and it sort of suited those kind of things. And the Spender BC1 was a perfect example of that.
So nothing's changed then. Old men with strange tastes. So.
Well, I think you're being a little bit cruel on the modern Spender brand, but I mean, So the BC1, if anyone's ever heard one, is a very polite and clean sounding speaker that is a reasonably flat frequency response, and worked very well, I think, with sort of mid 70s Radio 2.
Yes.
And Radio 3 actually, and Radio 4 come to that.
Yeah.
But it was not really suitable for the sort of young whippersnapper music playing on Radio 1 at the time. It wasn't a disco speaker, was it?
Then enter the Mission 770s.
Yep.
And just sort of changed the game a little bit there, didn't it? Because, even though they weren't quite my cup of tea, I do completely appreciate what they did.
Yeah.
Because, they were trailblazing at the time. You had... They were... Well, in your analogy, they were Radio 1 speakers, weren't they?
Yeah, much more so. They were kind of, Radio 1 at night on FM, with kind of Tommy Vance and John Peel and Nightingale, those kind of, rather than, Dave Lee Travis.
Sure.
But, they were, the original 770s were much more a kind of young and kind of freaky and happening and cool and fun type of speaker as far as the British speaker market was going, I think, compared to the the BC1s and the older kind of Rogers type stuff, BBC type stuff.
And the proof of the pudding was in the eating, because they sold by the bucket loads, didn't they? Incredibly popular loudspeaker.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, late 70s, early 80s.
Well, I think you could almost call them the first ever modern British speaker. They of the modern age. They were fun and snappy and propulsive and clean, they kind of went for a different demographic than, if you think of a sort of traditional British speaker as a kind of underpants beige Rover P6,
Yes.
And these were more kind of Ford Capri 3-litre S, weren't they?
Good analogy.
Very good analogy. In sort of,
Yes.
bright green or something.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, they were much more fun, and I think that it was, it not only launched Mission and made Mission the huge name that it later became, and Mission virtually, certainly in the 80s and 90s, kind of owned, that the sort of affordable speaker market, didn't it?
100%, yeah. And then made, other great products on the back of that. But these were, look, forgive me if I'm wrong, with Farad Asma design. Back in the, he was a proper hi-fi legend.
He was,
well.
yeah. He was a huge character.
Yeah.
And, I think these I might be corrected, but as far as I know, they were the only speaker that Farad designed, fully from the beginning at least. I think Henry Asma his brother did a lot of the later missions, and Farad was he was using the Spender BC1 as his kind of benchmark, but he was trying to do a sort of fun and snappy version of that, so it would have the sort of cleanness and the sort of smoothness of the Spender, but it would be much better in the time domain.
But he wasn't all about measuring, was he? Which the Spenders probably would have been. He would get people to actually come in and listen to them during the design process, and and find out what people actually liked about them in the real world.
Yeah,
and that's been transposed into these ones, haven't they? Into the new 770s, because a lot of the design process has been around what people think of them and how they sound.
Yeah,
which is great, isn't it? I like that. I like that thought process, because I think you just measure something, it doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah.
But if you actually listen to it, and you get to work out actually the human connection between the speaker and the person. I think we've got the same. Different designer, obviously.
Yeah. So Peter Como did the new 770, and it's this very strange coincidence, really, because when the original 770 came out, Peter was. And I know him well. I known him for a long time, and actually worked with him in some ways as well, which is a story for another time. But Peter was a hi-fi journalist in the mid-late 70s for Hi-Fi Answers magazine, and he was one of the kind of new generation of hi-fi reviewers who were much more focused on subjective sound quality. Because, again, I'm sure the millennials won't realise this, and the Generation Yers watching this, but back in the old days, when we were lads, etc., they had, hi-fi magazines were very measurement-oriented. All of them were, weren't they?
Yes.
And, can you remember reading the average hi-fi review?
Gosh. It's just, here's a picture of my oscilloscope.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Heavens. Yeah. So you used to have kind of like 2 pages of, the transient intermodulation distortion was, bad, and the whatever it was good, and the so on. And then at the end you'd have a 1 paragraph saying, the subjective sound quality was perceived to be adequate, and that's all you could get from a hi-fi magazine review, wasn't it?
You need to probably have adenoids as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, kind of John Major voice, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you're so true. But wasn't there a Haybrook connection in there as well?
Yeah. So Peter was reviewing for Hi-Fi Mags at sort of mid-70s for Hi-Fi Answers, and later others as well, I think. But he was one of the few who were trying to do reviewing in a more subjective way.
Yes.
And he was, even though he was, I think, very, well versed in engineering, electronics, mechanical engineering, and probably did own an oscilloscope. He also owned a pair of ears as well. And so round about that time, Farad came up with this very interesting design of speaker, and then spent, as you say, a lot of time voicing it. listening to it, courting the opinions of a guy that you and I know and like. Well, we know him from reading him, Paul Benson.
Yes.
Who was editing Hi-Fi Answers in the late 70s, but also did stuff for the Flat Response and Hi-Fi Review, I think, later.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but Farad was sort of getting the opinions of many journalists who he liked, and doing an awful lot of tweaking and voicing for the original 770s. And Peter Como told me that that's really that there are three defining features of the original 770. So firstly is its polypropylene mid-bass cone, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Also its light, thin-walled cabinet, which has got sort of damping inside, which is again unusual for the time because they tended to be sort of much thicker blocks of planks of wood kind of thing.
Yes.
So basically, the light cabinet doesn't store energy as much as the older style, thicker,
dense
material.
Yeah.
The other third distinguishing factor with the original 770 was the fact that they spent so much time voicing it.
Yes,
so instead of saying, well, right, that measure's okay, finished, they spent ages listening to it late at night in Farad's apartment, apparently, and just deciding, tuning the crossover and tweaking, every sort of part of it. So it was a very modern speaker in that respect.
As you say, the first of modern British speakers. And probably for that exact that reason. It's a great point.
Yeah.
And these ones, there's an awful lot of parallels, aren't there? In terms of construction, lots of the original design ethos, which you've just described really well, are still in there.
Yeah.
Thinner cabinets, polyprop speakers, etc.
Yeah.
All really cool. A lot of careful listening's got in from various people to tweak the sound.
Yep.
And as a result, the end result is, I've got to say, I think they sound terrific.
Yeah.
I really do. They really sound like a grown-up speaker now. They sound like Mission 770s, which have matured.
Yeah.
And come an awfully long way. So I mean, it's a cliche, isn't it, when you say they don't really do anything badly, but they don't really do anything badly. They've got a lovely top end, great amount of grunt.
Yeah.
They're a ported speaker, and also you were saying with the polypropane drive units, they can be a little bit bloaty. That's one of the trademarks.
Yes, I think maybe I'd say warm. So they've got a sort of soft around the edges kind of feel. The kind of tone of the polypropylene cones tends to be sort of slightly on the warm side, and if it's not done particularly well with the surrounds and stuff, it can sound a bit bloaty.
Yes,
definitely, but it doesn't necessarily have to. But it's certainly a lot warmer than, for example, a Kevlar cone that B&W were using, or kind of metal cones and all that kind of thing. And it probably sounded negative. I didn't wish it to. I like it. I think the bottom end sounds absolutely lovely. Yeah.
They image beautifully.
Yeah.
They look great. I really like them.
Yeah.
I mean, the ones which we have are walnut with white fronts, with black Mission writing on, looks really smart, I think, in a kind of retro way. It's sort of retro meets modern. And in fact, even things like the stands are really nice. It's smart looking loudspeakers, single wired, no bi-wiring going on or anything like that. So we bi-amp them into a pair of Exposure 4 amplifiers, Exposure 4s. Used a very interesting preamp, which we'll do a riff on, which is the Finestra preamp, which you may not have heard of. It was made by a company called EC Audio, who was Tom Evans, and it was just a glorious bit of equipment. Anyway,
complete honey of a preamp.
We'll come back to that. We'll talk about it with Finestra on a day.
Intervention here. So you never stop talking about your NameMate One mic, but that I mean, nice as that is, your Finestra is really special. And you've hardly ever mentioned it.
It's one of the best preamplifiers ever made. Without a shadow of a doubt.
I'd agree.
And probably one of the rarest as well.
Has it got the original box?
No.
Okay.
It hasn't.
All right. Well, forget about that.
But in terms of the sound quality, I think the 770s are sounding amazing.
Yeah.
Playing all sorts of different types of music from Grace Jones to Daft Punk to whatever. I think the hallmark of great speakers, they seem to have plenty of time.
Yeah.
They're never rushed.
Yeah.
You came up with a belter earlier, which I hadn't heard before, which I think is brilliant. It's like, they don't sound like you're trying to squeeze toothpaste out of a tube.
Yeah.
I do like that. And you said, you get speakers with multiple small drive units and you feel like you're trying to squash the sound out. With these, with their nice big bass units, it just flows.
Yeah.
And they don't feel like they're rushed. They feel like they've got plenty of time for the presentation.
Yeah.
But it's still incredibly detailed.
Yeah.
And nuanced. And it sounds a bit crazy, but I'd say they're almost quite delicate in a way. And the thing which they do brilliantly for me, which I think a lot of the toothpaste speakers don't, is they work really well at low volumes. They hardly lose anything at low volumes. And I just think that's the sign of a really well thought out and designed speaker.
I agree completely. So I think that you've got obviously there's been a trend in recent years for these kind of tower loudspeakers which have a narrow front baffle.
Yes.
And basically they have 135 or 165 millimeter, basically 6-inch, that kind of width at the maximum, 5 or 6 inch drive units, and have like maybe 2 or 3 of them in together, rather than having one larger diameter drive unit. And the 770 goes back to the 70s where normal speakers used to have at least the mid bass or the bass unit would be at the very least 8 inches.
Yes.
That was regarded as small, basically, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So you've got, I think, I've been told so many times by speaker designers that it's just as good to have 2 6-inch bass units rather than 1 12. But I'm still not convinced about that at all.
Well, look at your NS1000s. They've got a big whopping drum unit.
They've got
My
12.
Barracks have got a decent 2 back to back, I guess.
Yeah.
Slightly different principle, but Sarah's. My Sarah's got 2 massive drive units.
Yeah.
I like that. I do like that.
Well, I think that the thing is that if you've got multiple drivers, you've got basically mechanical loss on the voice coils on those each driver.
Sure.
Whereas with one single larger driver, you've proportionally got less loss, and you've got the ability to just move that bigger cone, and it doesn't have to wheeze and push and
No.
And so using a bike analogy, and we're both sort of bikers, it's like having a kind of big sort of V twin rather than a screamy parallel twin of a smaller size that produces just as much power, but you have to rev it and push it.
Sure.
So,
and I think one of the issues with speakers with large bass units and a treble unit only is sometimes the mid range can be a bit weird because the bass unit's doing so much stuff.
Yeah.
Not with these.
No,
it's lovely.
No.
It's just lovely.
It works really well, and the drive unit in these is it's still a polyprop, but it's mineral loaded apparently, so it's more rigid, so it's not flopping around as much as a kind of polypropylene,
props,
plastic.
No pun intended.
Yes, exactly. So this is a sort of form of polypropylene. I think this material in my Coke bottle. So it's loaded to make it more rigid, but it's still relatively light compared to Beckstream that came before it, I think.
Yes.
So yes, and it has a certain, as we say, kind of warm and pleasing sound, doesn't it? That kind of material.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think Peter Como's harnessed that really well.
I agree.
Matches the tweeter really well. He hasn't used a metal dome or anything.
No.
So you've got a kind of plastic dome tweeter, which I think is a sort of 25mm, like a 1-inch kind of thing.
Sure.
And you've got that large front baffle.
Yes.
And a big bass port down at the front firing, and obviously front firing, it's going to be less fussy about room placement as well if it's not firing into the rear.
A wall,
So
and I think they come in British pounds wise about £3,000 for a pair?
Yeah,
something around that.
3-3, I think.
3-3
at the
is
moment.
it? Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And so there's some competition there. And we talked about the ATCs being,
Yeah.
you know, which we both really like as well. And we did a review of those. And we do like the ATCs,
Yeah.
without a doubt. But I really like these.
Yeah.
And I think they're well priced for what you get. They don't seem too hard to drive. They're pretty cool speakers.
Yeah, I agree. I think they are relatively easy to drive. They sound, as you said before, they sound very good at low volume.
Yeah.
But they sound good when you push them. They'll take power in a way that the originals wouldn't.
True.
They have a sort of benign and warm and friendly sound, but it's lively and dynamic and punchy as well, isn't it? It's not flat and boring.
Not in the least.
No. And it does sort of sound retro in a good way, I'd say, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Yeah.
So look, let's do a scoring. Mike and Dave Hi-Fi Riff on the Mission 770s. What do you think?
Yeah, I think speakers are always a matter of taste, aren't they? So we love, and we've made a big deal about the ATC SEM40s, which are similar price, slightly more expensive, but they are obviously floor standers and they kind of do a different job.
Yes.
That's the sort of money you're in, and you can buy some good speakers at that price. So it's a tough one, and it really is down to taste. But if you like that sort of smooth and open and big and friendly sound, it's very hard to think of anything better near that price. So I'm going to give them a 9. And I love the concept. I love that Peter Como's redone them, and he was around at the time the originals were there.
Yes.
Kind of reviewing and measuring them, and of course later went on to do Haybrook HB1s, which is another classic speaker that we'll be talking about.
We will talk about those most definitely.
Yeah.
And for me, I wasn't a massive fan of the original 770s. Heard them quite often. Never really did it for me. These new ones, absolutely hats off to the guys. They've done a great job, and I'm not going to give them anything less than a 9 for that reason.
Yeah.
Because they're just super, and I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to them. So great stuff, and there we are.
Yep.
So look, another episode of Mike and Dave's Hi-Fi Riff. I hope you enjoyed that, and we will look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.